This video was brought to you by Incogni. Last week, it was reported that the United States is preparing to impose sanctions on an Israeli military battalion in what would be a significant first. But while much of the world's attention has been on Gaza, the sanctions in question are not actually in response to the events in Gaza. Instead, they're related to human rights violations in the occupied West Bank, a tinderbox territory where tensions and violence have been rising even before October 7th. So in this video, we're going to explain the new US sanctions and explore what's going on with this parallel conflict in the West Bank. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Last weekend, Axios reported that the US would soon impose sanctions on the Israeli military's Netzar Yehuda battalion, which is an all-male special unit for ultra-Orthodox Jewish soldiers that, according to Axios, has become a destination for many young, radical right-wing settlers who weren't accepted into any other combat unit. At the time of writing, these sanctions have not been publicly confirmed or announced, though Secretary of State Antony Blinken has indicated that he would soon make an announcement. The sanctions would be imposed under the Leahy Law, which bans the US government from funding and assisting foreign security forces credibly implicated in gross violations of human rights. Now, this law has been used plenty of times before, but never against an Israeli unit. The Netzar Yehuda battalion was previously stationed in the West Bank, then was reassigned to the Golan Heights in late 2022, and then, post-October 7th, has served in Gaza. However, according to Axios, the US's decision to impose sanctions on the unit is based entirely on incidents that occurred in the West Bank, not Gaza, before October 7th last year. In fact, the US began investigating the unit in 2022 amid growing accusations of violence against Palestinians. One notable example that drew US attention was the death in custody of 78-year-old Palestinian American Omar Assad in January 2022, who had been gagged, handcuffed, left on the cold ground, and was ultimately found dead following a cardiac arrest. Now, just for some very quick context, the West Bank has been occupied by Israel since it was captured in 1967. Then, the Oslo Accords in the 1990s established limited self-governance for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, with the view to an eventual, but as yet unrealized, full Palestinian statehood. The Accords also split the West Bank into three areas. The first under full Palestinian Authority control, the second under joint Palestinian and Israeli control, with the two cooperating on security while the Palestinian Authority manages civil affairs, and the last under full Israeli control. Anyway, following the reports of the incoming sanctions on the Netzar Yehuda battalion, Israeli political leaders reacted unhappily. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that imposing sanctions on an Israeli military unit during the ongoing war against Hamas is the height of absurdity and a moral low, adding that his government will act by all means against these moves. Meanwhile, War Cabinet member Benny Gantz, who is viewed more favorably than Netanyahu by US policymakers, said that the Netzar Yehuda battalion is an inseparable part of the Israeli military, and that Israel has a strong, independent judicial system to deal with conduct violations. For reference, following the aforementioned death of Omar Assad, the battalion's commander was reprimanded, 2 officers were dismissed, but no criminal charges were pursued. Gantz also said that sanctioning the unit sets a dangerous precedent and conveys the wrong message to our shared enemies during wartime, and that he would act to have the decision changed. Now, these incoming sanctions represent the latest example of the US taking a more punitive stance against Israel's actions in the West Bank compared to Gaza. Just last week, the US announced new sanctions on 2 entities accused of fundraising for extremist Israeli settlers who'd already been sanctioned for violence against Palestinians, and also imposed sanctions on Ben Zion Gopstein, an extremist settler known for being close to the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. For context, Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, which are illegal under international law, are one of the main sources of contention between the US and Israel, as Israel disputes their illegality. Some 3 million Palestinians live in the West Bank, and there are well over 500,000 Israeli settlers living there too, as successive Israeli governments have supported the establishment and expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Now, the US and Israel's close relationship means that public American criticism of Israel is fairly uncommon, but the Biden administration has described the expansion of settlements as counterproductive to reaching an enduring peace and inconsistent with international law. Despite the opposition of the US and the international community, Israel is still pressing ahead with expanding its settlements. In fact, just last month, the government announced plans for more than 3,400 new settlement homes, as well as declaring 800 hectares of land in the West Bank as property of the state, said to be the biggest piece of land seized by Israel since the early 90s. This has obviously inflamed tensions in the territory that was already a tinderbox even before Hamas's October 7th attack sparked the ongoing Gaza war. In fact, pre-October 7th, 2023 was already on course to see settler attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank reach their highest level since the UN started recording data in 2006. And in the 6.5 months since October 7th, the UN has recorded 774 Israeli settler attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank. In that same time period, according to the UN, more than 450 Palestinians, including 112 children, have been killed in the West Bank. Most of them were killed by Israeli forces during operations or during exchanges between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants, while others were killed by armed Israeli settlers, sometimes in the presence of Israeli forces. Meanwhile, at least 17 Israelis, including one child, have been killed, mostly by Palestinians. In a sign of how volatile the situation is, in the past week or so, the Israeli military carried out one of its largest raids in the West Bank, claiming to kill 10 terrorists, while Palestinians put the death toll at 14, including a child. Elsewhere, a Palestinian ambulance driver was killed while transporting Palestinians wounded in an attack by Israeli settlers. There was also a deadly rampage by Israeli settlers against Palestinians that was sparked by the killing of a 14-year-old Israeli boy, for which a Palestinian man has been arrested. Now, all of this serves as a reminder that the Israel-Palestine conflict is far from limited to just Gaza, and has brought renewed attention to the West Bank, with the sanctions targeting violent settlers not just being imposed by the US, but also the likes of the UK and EU. But the US sanctioning an Israeli battalion, despite being an unprecedented move and unwelcome in Israel, is not indicative of an overall shift in the US's Israeli policy. After all, the US Congress just passed a military aid package for Israel worth tens of billions of dollars. The Israeli government, meanwhile, looks dead set on expanding settlements, even in the face of international opposition. This, combined with the continuing war in Gaza, a Palestinian Authority deeply unpopular with Palestinians, and boiling tensions and violence across the West Bank, suggests that any kind of resolution really remains distant. While you've been watching this video, you might not have realized that shady forces in the background are trying to collect your personal data from various sites, bundle it together, and sell it to a third party. These data brokers can then sell your information to anyone, from a company to an online criminal. Now, you might assume that you're always safe online. Perhaps you regularly change your password, or even unsubscribe from those annoying email newsletters that you never even remember signing up for. But unfortunately, this doesn't always save you. Companies that hold your data can still fall victim to a data breach, meaning that these data brokers can still compile all of your information and sell it on to others. The good news is that you have a right to protect your privacy and request that data brokers delete your personal information. But the bad news is that it would take you years to do it manually. And even then, you'd need to repeat this process every few months as data brokers continue collecting your data. Luckily though, this is where our sponsor Incogni comes in. Incogni reaches out to those data brokers on your behalf, requests that your data is removed, and deals with any problems that might arise. Even more, Incogni is persistent and will put in multiple data removal requests even after your data has been removed to ensure that it doesn't go back on the market. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, if you use our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.